But I wonder, she'd probably be funnier.
Eye on Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's former home, Frogmore Cottage.
There are moments in royal history when silence is louder than any confession. When a name is never mentioned, not because it is forgotten, but because it is understood. And inside the royal ecosystem, Sarah Ferguson has always been one of the most underestimated observers. People mistook her warmth for foolishness, her openness for weakness, her survival for luck. But Fergie didn't survive by accident. She survived by knowing when to speak, when to smile, and when to let the truth sit quietly until the timing was right. And timing, as Fergie knows better than anyone, is everything. We're told to vacate Windsor's Royal Lodge. A source close. For decades, she protected Prince Andrew, not out of romance, not out of loyalty, but out of mutual understanding. They shared history, habits, environments, and secrets. Fergie knew the rules of elite indulgence long before the world learned the word yacht carried more meaning than leisure. She knew what happened on those boats, who was invited, why certain women were present, and what expectations followed once the champagne was poured and the coastline disappeared. So when Meghan Markle entered the royal orbit years later, Fergie didn't see a fairy tale. She saw a familiar pattern wearing a new face. That's why when Meghan once told the now infamous story about meeting Prince Andrew for the first time, claiming she thought he was merely a man holding the Queen's handbag, Fergie didn't laugh. She didn't correct it. She didn't defend Andrew or challenge Meghan. She stayed silent. And in royal language, silence is never neutral. Because Fergie knew Andrew. She knew his presence filled rooms. She knew he was never mistaken for staff. And she knew that anyone who had already moved through elite European social circles, luxury hospitality networks, and private yachting environments would never fail to recognize him. That story wasn't playful. It was deliberate. It was narrative distance. And distance is only required when proximity existed before the official timeline. What the public didn't know, what Fergie always suspected, was that Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew did not meet for the first time within royal walls. They met long before titles, engagements, and palace protocol entered the picture.
I think that I've now, at 63 years old, suddenly owned that it's not a bad thing to speak your voice.
According to accounts that circulated quietly for years, passed hand-to-hand but never printed, Meghan and Andrew were both present aboard a private yacht in February 2002, anchored off the coast of Nice. This was not a party boat. This was not a floating nightclub. This was an invitation-only environment curated, discreet, and understood by those on board. Everyone knew why they were there. No introductions were necessary. Andrew was the most important guest. Meghan was not anonymous. An eyewitness account passed privately through intermediaries and never formally recorded described an immediate shift in dynamics once Andrew boarded. Conversations reoriented. Seating changed. Attention followed rank. Within hours, Meghan was allegedly positioned beside Andrew exclusively. Within a day, they were no longer present on deck together. Meals were delivered below. Privacy was requested. The rest of the guests noticed. These things are never invisible on yachts. There is nowhere to disappear without being seen disappearing. What followed, according to the account, were 3 days of near total seclusion. When they re-emerged, the atmosphere had changed. There was familiarity, expectation, the kind of quiet entitlement that forms when one party believes something has been established. And then, just as quickly, the yacht returned to shore. Lives resumed. Andrew flew back to London. And what happened next is the part of the story that explains everything that followed. Because contact did not end when the yacht docked. According to the account, Meghan attempted to maintain communication. Calls were made. Messages were sent. Initially, there was response. Then there wasn't. Andrew disengaged the way he had always disengaged, with institutional efficiency. Staff intercepted communication. Access was cut. Silence replaced connection. And for someone accustomed to upward mobility through proximity, that silence was not just rejection. It was a racer. But this was not casual persistence. The urgency mattered.
There was like photos with her and Prince Andrew way back in the day when she was like in her early 20s.
The claim passed through the same chain of whispered testimony as that Meghan believed she was pregnant. Whether that belief was confirmed, misinterpreted, or momentary is not the point. The point is that she believed Andrew needed to know, and Andrew never responded. He did not deny. He did not explain. He disappeared. Inside royal systems, distance is how crises are neutralized. If a problem cannot be acknowledged, it cannot exist. And if a person has no access, they have no leverage. According to the account, with no response and no path forward, a decision was made. After that, all communication ceased. No records, no photographs, no public trace, only memory. And memory is dangerous when it belongs to people who were once close enough to matter. Years passed. Lives diverged. Meghan rebuilt her trajectory. Andrew continued his. And the royal family remained insulated by the same silence it always relied upon. Until Meghan re-entered the royal world through a different door. This time not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as a duchess. That is when history became dangerous again. Because proximity returned, because familiarity resurfaced, and because people like Sarah Ferguson don't forget patterns, they recognize them. Fergie didn't need evidence. She didn't need confirmation. She knew Andrew's habits. She knew the environments he favored. She knew how stories were managed, buried, and traded for silence. And she knew Meghan's ambition because she had lived it herself, only without the safety net of modern PR machines and curated victimhood. The difference between them was not instinct, it was timing. For years, Fergie stayed quiet because silence benefited her. It allowed her access. It allowed her survival. It allowed her to remain adjacent to power. Meghan followed the same rule until she didn't. The moment Meghan chose distance over diplomacy, the moment she stopped playing the long game, she didn't just sever ties, she activated witnesses. Because when someone like Sarah Ferguson stops protecting a silence, it isn't emotional, it's strategic. Meghan Markle is uniquely expendable within royal dynamics. She carries no bloodline immunity. She holds no institutional protection. She is connected but not embedded. Prince William is untouchable. His narrative is stable. King Charles is cautious. He understands containment. Andrew, however, has always relied on others to absorb the consequences of his past. And now, the one woman who understood all the rules, all the habits, and all the silences no longer benefits from keeping them. Secrets don't disappear, they wait. And when someone with memory, motive, and nothing left to lose allows a story to surface, even indirectly, the truth doesn't whisper. It resurfaces with intent. And once it does, the story is no longer about yachts or rumors or denials. It becomes about who knew and who chose silence. Because inside royal families, the most dangerous stories are not the ones that explode loudly. They are the ones that sit quietly, known by many, denied by all, and waiting for the one moment when silence is no longer profitable. And that moment, according to those watching closely, has finally arrived. What makes Sarah Ferguson's shift so significant is not what she has said publicly, but what she has stopped correcting privately. For years, palace-friendly journalists floated sanitized versions of Andrew's past, softened edges, blurred timelines. Convenient amnesia dressed up as misunderstanding. And Fergie reliably never intervened. She allowed confusion to stand. She allowed speculation to scatter. She allowed truth to remain fragmented. But lately, something has changed. Sources close to royal social circles began noticing that Fergie no longer deflects when Meghan's name is mentioned in the same breath as Andrew's. She doesn't redirect. She doesn't scoff. She listens. And in aristocratic code, listening is permission. Because Fergie understands something Meghan never fully grasped. The institution doesn't reward disruption. It rewards endurance. Meghan believed the system could be bent by exposure. That pressure would force apology, that public sympathy could overpower centuries of containment. Fergie learned the opposite lesson. She learned that survival comes from knowing when to retreat and when to let others fall first. And Meghan, whether she realized it or not, positioned herself perfectly to be the fall. Once Meghan became a working royal, the old whispers suddenly carried new risk. Not because they were new, but because they were now adjacent to the throne. Andrew's past had always been tolerated at a distance. Meghan erased that distance simply by existing within palace walls. And for those who manage reputations, proximity is everything. This is why certain doors quietly closed for her long before the public fallout ever began.
Jeffrey Epstein, and King Charles has very much been dragged into this. The king has been heckled during an official...
Staff reassigned, invitations delayed, support cooled. Meghan interpreted this as hostility, racism, jealousy, institutional cruelty. What she didn't consider was fear, not of her power, but of her unpredictability. She didn't understand the difference between leverage and liability. And by refusing to play quietly, she became both. Behind closed doors, comparisons were being drawn, not flattering ones. Senior figures reportedly noted the parallels between Meghan's trajectory and Fergie's early years. Ambition, access. Impatience, but also the crucial divergence. Fergie made mistakes publicly, yes, but she never challenged the institution's authority to decide who stayed protected. Meghan did, and that made her dangerous. That danger intensified when Harry's proximity amplified her voice. Because Harry wasn't just a prince. He was the one variable the institution could never fully control. Emotional, reactive, loyal to a fault, and most importantly, willing to burn bridges without understanding what lay on the other side. When Meghan and Harry exited royal duties, they believed they had won. They believed exposure was power. They believed the institution would collapse under modern scrutiny. What they failed to realize was that the palace had already adjusted. They weren't losing assets. They were shedding risk. And that's when the recalibration began. Meghan's past was no longer being shielded. Not actively attacked, but quietly unguarded. Stories that once would have been stamped out were allowed to circulate. Not confirmed, not denied, simply unattended. And Sarah Ferguson noticed. She had seen this pattern before. She had lived it. The slow withdrawal of protection, the silence that felt like freedom until it became abandonment. The moment you realize no one is making calls on your behalf anymore, that's when she understood that Meghan was no longer useful. And when someone is no longer useful, they become explanatory. The Yacht story, long dormant, suddenly fit into a broader narrative. The institution needed the public to accept that Meghan was not naive, not unprepared, not blindsided by royal life, but experienced, strategic, and familiar with elite transactional spaces long before Harry entered the picture. This reframing mattered.
And publicly apologized for taking abusers' cash and vowed to cut ties with him.
Because if Meghan was worldly, connected, and ambitious long before the palace, then the victim narrative weakened. And if the victim narrative weakened, accountability shifted. Fergie didn't need to say this aloud. Others began saying it for her. Suddenly, journalists began referencing Meghan's pre-royal connections. Suddenly phrases like well-traveled, socially adept, and no stranger to elite circles appeared, where once there had been outsider and genuine. The story didn't accuse, it contextualized, and context in royal storytelling is everything. The yacht rumor resurfaced, not as a headline, but as background noise. The kind that seeps into consciousness without demanding belief. The kind that allows people to connect dots on their own. And Sarah Ferguson let it happen because she understood that the most effective exposure is never direct. It's ambient. It allows the subject to discredit themselves through overreaction. And Meghan predictably reacted. She denied familiarity. She mocked the idea. She leaned harder into reinvention. But every denial added friction. Every rewrite invited scrutiny. Every insistence on innocence invited contrast. And contrast is where institutions win. Because while Meghan was fighting perception, Andrew remained untouched, not defended, but irrelevant. His past was already priced in. The system had absorbed it long ago. Meghan's, however, was still malleable, which made her the safer story to tell. This is the part no one wants to acknowledge. Royal survival is not about morality. It's about load-bearing structures. Andrew is ugly but contained. Meghan is disruptive, loud, and unpredictable. And when pressure builds, the system always releases pressure where it does the least damage. Sarah Ferguson understands this better than anyone alive. She knows that the truth doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to be plausible enough to shift sympathy. And once sympathy moves, protection follows. That's why she hasn't spoken publicly. She hasn't needed to. Her silence is doing the work. Because when the woman who spent decades protecting a man stops correcting a narrative that implicates him by proximity, that isn't betrayal. It's permission. And the palace understands exactly what that means. The real exposure isn't about yachts or timelines or whispered pregnancies. It's about something far more dangerous. The suggestion that Meghan Markle was never as uninitiated as she claimed, and that the institution knew it all along. And if that perception takes hold, everything changes. Because then the story isn't about a woman wronged by royalty. It's about a woman who misjudged which silences would protect her and which ones would eventually speak. What Meghan never seemed to understand is that the palace doesn't retaliate the way outsiders expect. It doesn't shout. It doesn't sue. It doesn't issue dramatic statements or emotional rebuttals. It waits. It watches. And then when the moment is right, it steps aside and allows gravity to do the rest. Because gravity is ruthless. Once the protective barrier fell away, Meghan's story began to sag under its own contradictions. Dates blurred. Anecdotes shifted. Timelines no longer aligned. And the more she spoke, the more visible the gaps became. Not because journalists suddenly became braver, but because they no longer received the quiet calls discouraging curiosity. That's how institutional withdrawal works. One day, the phone rings, the next day, it doesn't. And suddenly, people feel free to ask questions they were once gently steered away from. The yacht story resurfaced in this exact vacuum. Not as an accusation, but as a curiosity, not as an expose, but as a background detail. It appeared in whispers at first, industry dinners, private briefings, off-the-record conversations, the same sentence repeated again and again. It's not new. It's just no longer protected. And Sarah Ferguson understood precisely what was happening. She had lived through her own unprotect. She remembered the shift when smiles remained, but effort disappeared when loyalty evaporated without announcement. She remembered how quickly a woman could become a cautionary tale once the institution decided she was no longer worth defending. That recognition is why Fergie didn't intervene. Because intervening would have required choosing sides, and she had already chosen not out of malice, but out of realism. Meghan had broken the unspoken rule. Never threaten. The structure that allows you to exist inside it. Once you do that, you're not punished. You're processed, and processing had begun. What followed was subtle, but unmistakable. Meghan's credibility stopped being assumed. Claims that once passed unchallenged began attracting qualifiers. Phrases like, according to Meghan, and as she has said, appeared where certainty once lived. Her voice remained loud, but its authority thinned. Meanwhile, Andrew remained exactly where he had always been, peripheral, unpleasant, but institutionally neutralized. His sins were known quantities. Meghan's unpredictability was not. This is where the calculus becomes uncomfortable. From the palace's perspective, allowing Meghan's past to be question-solved. Multiple problems at once. It weakened her moral leverage. It reframed her as an operator rather than an innocent. And it shifted public focus away from structural critique and toward personal credibility. And the yacht rumor did something else, too. It collapsed the outsider myth. If Meghan had moved in elite spaces long before Harry, if she understood transactional proximity, if she had already navigated men of power without titles attached, then the story of naivety dissolved. She was no longer the woman blindsided by royal cruelty. She was the woman who miscalculated how much insulation she truly had. That distinction matters because institutions can forgive ambition. They cannot forgive exposure. Sarah Ferguson knew this because she had paid for it herself publicly, painfully, and permanently. The difference was that Fergie never attempted to dismantle the monarchy on her way out. She embarrassed it. She strained it, but she never declared war. Meghan did. And war invites collateral damage. This is why behind the scenes there was no panic about the yacht story, no frantic suppression, no emergency denials. There was only quiet acknowledgement. A shared understanding that if this narrative gained traction, it would not threaten the throne. It would threaten Meghan. And so the system let it breathe. As the whispers grew, so did the reinterpretation of Meghan's behavior inside royal life. Her impatience was no longer framed as culture shock. Her demands were no longer seen as assertiveness. Her conflicts with staff were no longer chalked up to misunderstanding. They became patterns. Patterns once named are difficult to erase. This is when Sarah Ferguson's role became unmistakable to those paying attention. Not because she spoke, but because she didn't. In royal circles, silence is rarely empty. It's usually directional. Fergie's silence said, "I recognize this story." It said, this when Sarah Ferguson's role became unmistakable to those paying attention. Not because she spoke, but because she didn't. In royal circles, silence is rarely empty. It's usually directional. Fergie's silence said, "I recognize this story." It said, "This is familiar." It said, "I won't stop it." And that silence carried more weight than any interview ever could. Because Sarah Ferguson knows the most devastating truths are not shouted. They are allowed. Allowed to circulate. Allowed to settle. Allowed to be believed without being proven. Meghan, meanwhile, continued fighting the wrong battle. She pushed harder against the monarchy, not realizing the monarchy had already stepped out of the ring. She tried to reclaim narrative control through repetition, through visibility, through insistence. But insistence without protection sounds desperate, and desperation is contagious. The irony is brutal. The very institution Meghan accused of cruelty extended her the one mercy it always offers: distance. She could have taken it. She could have faded quietly into celebrity obscurity. She could have preserved ambiguity. Instead, she kept talking. And every word widened the gap between who she said she was and who she appeared to be. The yacht story didn't need confirmation. It only needed resonance. And it found it in the growing sense that Meghan Markle was not undone by the palace, but by her own misreading of power. Because power doesn't always strike back. Sometimes it just stops holding you up. And when that happens, the fall feels personal, but it's procedural. Sarah Ferguson understands that better than anyone. And this time, she isn't cushioning the landing. Once gravity takes over, there is a moment when the person falling still believes they can negotiate with the air. That was Meghan's mistake. She assumed visibility was leverage. She assumed repetition could overpower doubt. She assumed that because she had once been protected, that protection was permanent. But protection in royal ecosystems is never unconditional. It is transactional, temporary, and above all silent. And the silence around her had become deafening. Behind closed doors, advisors stopped offering strategy and began offering caution. Invitations slowed. Projects stalled. Partnerships that once felt inevitable suddenly required reassessment. The language shifted in ways that insiders instantly recognize. No one said no. They said not now. And not now is the beginning of the end. This is where the story takes a turn that most people miss. Because while Meghan was losing institutional protection, Sarah Ferguson was regaining something else entirely. Relevance, without obligation. Fergie had reached a point in life where reputation no longer functioned as currency. She had already spent it, lost it, rebuilt it into something quieter and more durable. Survival credibility. She didn't need approval. She didn't need access. She didn't need the palace's permission to exist. That freedom changes how a person carries memory. Fergie didn't suddenly decide to expose anything. She simply stopped editing herself in private conversations. She stopped correcting assumptions. She stopped redirecting narratives when they drifted too close to uncomfortable territory. And in royal circles, that alone is revelation. People began to notice that when Meghan's name came up in discussions about Andrew's past, Fergie didn't bristle.
She didn't object.
She didn't distance herself. She listened. Listening in that environment is endorsement. It told those around her that this story was not absurd, not invented, not shocking, just inconvenient. And inconvenience is survivable when the person involved no longer matters enough to shield. What makes this dynamic particularly brutal is that Meghan never realized she was being repositioned. She thought she was fighting exclusion. In reality, she was being reclassified. No longer a threat, no longer a liability, no longer an asset, just a variable. And variables can be discussed
As.
This is when journalists began connecting dots they had previously ignored. Old photographs were re-examined with new context. Travel timelines were compared. Social overlaps, once dismissed as coincidence, were revisited as patterns. Not to accuse, but to question. And questions once legitimized do their own damage. The yacht narrative fit into this reassessment not because it was explosive, but because it was plausible. It aligned with known behavior, known environments, known trajectories. It didn't require conspiracy. It required only familiarity with how elite social ecosystems operate. Access precedes
Power.
silence precedes survival, and ambition often precedes miscalculation. The palace understands this math instinctively. Meghan never did. This is why her attempts to cast herself as uniquely victimized began to ring hollow. The public may not understand royal systems, but they understand inconsistency. And as more stories surfaced about staff turnover, about fractured alliances, about transactional relationships, the image of innocence gave way to something colder. Calculation. That shift was irreversible. Sarah Ferguson watched it unfold with a distance that bordered on clinical. Not because she enjoyed it, but because she recognized it. She had once been that woman, spoken about instead of spoken to, remembered selectively, defined by others. The difference was that Fergie had eventually learned to coexist with the truth. Meghan tried to overwrite it, and truth resists overwriting. As whispers hardened into narratives, something else happened quietly. People began reassessing Meghan's arrival into royal life itself. Not as destiny, not as fairy tale, but as culmination, a final step in a longer journey of proximity seeking. That reinterpretation didn't require malice. It required hindsight. The more Meghan insisted she had been unprepared, the more observers noticed how prepared she actually seemed, how fluent she was in elite environments, how quickly she adapted to power dynamics, how instinctively she understood leverage. Those aren't learned overnight. They are practiced, and practice implies precedent. This is where the yacht story becomes less about Andrew and more about exposure. Andrew's reputation was already fractured beyond repair. He was no longer central to the monarchy's future. Meghan, however, had positioned herself as a moral counterweight to royal decay. Once that positioning cracked, everything else followed. Sarah Ferguson understood the final irony before anyone else did. Meghan had made herself the story, and stories age faster than institutions. As the months passed, Meghan's presence began to feel less inevitable, less essential, less interesting. The attention she once commanded out of novelty shifted toward scrutiny. And scrutiny, when unmet with humility, curdles. This is when Fergie's silence became something closer to judgment. Not spoken, not public, but unmistakable. Those who had once asked her quietly to help smooth relations
Stopped asking.
Those who had once hoped she might intervene stopped hoping. The system had moved on. Meghan was no longer being managed. She was being observed. And observation is the final stage before irrelevance.
If I was talking Gen Z, I'd say slay.
In royal history, this is how figures disappear. Not with scandal, but with exhaustion. The public grows tired. The media loses interest. Allies disengage. Enemies don't even bother anymore. That is the fate Meghan never anticipated. She thought exposure would destroy her. In truth, indifference would. And that is why the yacht story matters. Not because it will ever be proven, denied, or confirmed, but because it reframes her entirely. It relocates her from exception to example, from disruption to repetition. Just another ambitious figure who misunderstood how close to the sun she could fly before the institution stopped pretending to care. Sarah Ferguson learned that lesson decades ago. Meghan is learning it now. And unlike Fergie, she doesn't yet know how to survive without the illusion that someone somewhere is still protecting her. And this is where the story settles into its final uncomfortable truth. Nothing explodes. No confession drops. No dramatic confrontation occurs. No palace statement confirms or denies anything. Because the most effective endings in royal life are never loud. They are procedural, administrative, quietly final.
Name one thing you couldn't live without.
My passport.
Do you have a middle name?
Yes, it's Meghan. My first name is actually Rachel.
What remains is not a scandal, but a residue. A lingering sense that something about Meghan's story never quite aligned. That the timelines felt curated. That the innocence felt rehearsed. That the grievances arrived fully formed. Already polished for broadcast. People don't need proof to feel dissonance. They just need repetition. And repetition has not been kind. Sarah Ferguson understands this better than anyone. She knows that survival inside royal gravity depends on knowing when to stop insisting and when to start enduring. She stopped insisting years ago. Meghan never did. That difference is everything. Fergie's power now lies not in what she says, but in what she no longer corrects. In the story she lets circulate unchallenged. In the knowing looks she doesn't disguise. In the silences she no longer fills. Silence, once weaponized, becomes verdict. The royal family will never address the yacht. They don't need to. The institution doesn't fight shadows. It waits for them to dissolve. And shadows always dissolve when the light moves on. Meghan, meanwhile, continues speaking as if the audience is frozen in time. Still sympathetic, still shocked, still invested. But the audience has aged. It has seen patterns repeat. It has noticed that every chapter centers her as the injured party. Every conflict ends with someone else at fault. Victimhood, when uninterrupted, becomes suspect. And suspicion doesn't require belief. It requires fatigue. This is why the end doesn't come with a downfall, but with a fade. Meghan is no longer debated with urgency. She is discussed with distance. Analyzed rather than defended, remembered selectively. That is how relevance is. Sarah Ferguson didn't expose Meghan with words. She exposed her by surviving long enough to be believed when she stopped protecting the myth. By remaining standing after the institution discarded her, by becoming proof that you can fall from favor and still exist. Meghan's fear has never been exposure. It has always been expendability. And expendability is exactly where she now sits. No longer protected, no longer prioritized, no longer dangerous enough to silence, just visible enough to be remembered, just distant enough to be forgotten. The royal machine will keep moving. It always does. Prince Andrew will remain a closed chapter no one wants to reopen. Sarah Ferguson will continue existing in the margins, underestimated and underestimated again. And Meghan Markle will remain suspended in the space between what she claimed to be and what the world now quietly suspects she was always becoming. Not a villain, not a victim, not a heroine, just another figure who mistook proximity to power for immunity from consequence. And in royal history, that mistake has only one ending, not ruin, obsolescence.